Well, it's time for us to begin tonight. Glad that you're able to be here with us. We're thankful that we have the opportunity to meet together and study God's Word. And we have an opportunity tonight to continue our series on what does the Bible say about. Next week, I will be out of town on school business. I won't be able to be here, but Brother Josh Walker is going to be filling in for me, and I'm looking forward to watching his lesson online to see what his class is about. I know he's talking about the incarnation of the Word, if I heard his title correctly when he told me what he planned to teach on. And so I know that will be a rich study and look forward to seeing it. But Lord willing, be back the following week and we will look at peacekeeping that week. But tonight, we're looking at evangelism. And I believe I had the PowerPoint put up there, Brother Dan. There we go. Perfect. What does the Bible say about evangelism? The week of March 15th through the 21st of 2020, I sat in my office at Somerville and I worked on a manuscript called Getting a Foot in the Door. It was all about evangelism. And I wrote all of these wonderful things about going where the people are and knocking on doors and doing all of this great stuff. I put the final period on that, sent it off to the editors to put it into the manuscript and the book, and we had a pandemic hit. And all of a sudden, everything that I had just written became outdated for a time. No longer were we encouraged to go door to door. We were told to stay away from people. Try not to be around people as much. Social distancing. And for a time, what used to be where you could have someone knock on your door slowly shifted to someone knocking on your door wearing a mask. And if you had told me 5 years ago that that's what our lives would look like in 2022, I would not have believed you. And yet, that's where we are. So many people are concerned about getting sick, and there are so many policies in place, and you never really know what one policy will be from one restaurant to another, one location to another. I walk into hotels sometimes when I'm traveling, and I see face masks required, and I kind of peek around the door to see if the night shift manager is wearing one before I walk in, because maybe they do require one, and I need to go get one. But all of a sudden, our lives changed, and for the longest time, we were told, stay away from people. Don't be around each other. And as we think about Bible study and evangelism, how do you combat that? How can I study the Bible with someone in a personal study if I can't be with them? And so tonight, we're going to try to look at ways that we can reach out to people. That's really the number one thing that I want you to take away from tonight is the opportunity that can be given. When we look at what the Bible says about evangelism, all the Bible really tells us to do with evangelism is to give an opportunity to people, to reach out and to tell people about the saving message of Jesus. Beyond that, I can't force anyone to think like I think, to believe what I believe, to do what I do. All I can do is say, here's what the Bible teaches. Now it's up to you to decide whether you're going to follow it or not. But in the first place, you know who loved the idea of being away from people more than anyone? It was the devil. Satan wants the door to stay closed. He doesn't want the door to be open. He doesn't want a foot to get in there. He doesn't want anybody to even knock on the door. He wants us to say, I can't do personal evangelism. I can't go out into my community. I can't knock on doors. I can't send cards. I can't make phone calls. I'm just going to need to be stuck. And he spends a lot of time trying to convince us to not be evangelistic. And he has certain tricks, I called them, in the lesson for tonight. And the first trick that he loves to use is that of suffering. No matter what you deal with in life, you have suffered something. I don't know the severity of it. I don't know whether it's a minor amount of suffering, whether it's a great amount of suffering, whether you might look at your life one day and say, I've been through a lot. But you've suffered something. And the devil wants you to look at that suffering and say, I can't do this because I'm dealing with X, Y, and Z. Well, there's three different types of suffering that we find in the Scriptures. One is suffering that you cause. That's what we have up there with 2 Samuel 12, verses 10 through 14. Had David and Bathsheba not committed adultery, the child would not have even died. The child wouldn't have even existed. That was later killed as a result as punishment for what they had done. Had David and Bathsheba not committed adultery, David's house would never have had the sword as a part of it and not departing from his house. And so the suffering that David experienced from that point forward, when Absalom, his own son, tried to kill him and take his throne, you can point back to that night and say, had it not been for that, David, you wouldn't be suffering. So there's suffering that we cause. We all make decisions in our lives that are sinful. We've all done it. We've all committed sin. That's what Romans is talking about in the first 3 chapters. And sometimes those sins have lasting consequences. We mentioned Moses from a perspective of wanting to go into the promised land, but was told that he wasn't allowed to be able to enter into it. Had Moses repented? Evidently he had made changes in his life, had repented, and yet the consequence for what he had done was that he could not enter into the promised land. And so God was firm on that decision. You look in the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah chapter 9 specifically, and you find that while they're praying a prayer of thanksgiving that they had confessed their sins, they were forgiven of their sins, there is a portion in about verses 27 through 33 where it says, even though, and I'm paraphrasing here, but even though we have repented, we are still servants in this land. Though we have repented, though we've changed, though we've gotten back into a covenant relationship with God, we are still facing the consequences of that sin in that we are still captives. And we're still dealing with that captivity. The book of Deuteronomy 28 tells us all about the suffering that would come upon God's people if they don't follow Him. That's not just spiritually speaking. That's anything in life. If I don't do something that's right, I can't be upset when the consequences that are negative come back upon me. So there's suffering that we can cause. Then the second type that we find often throughout the Scriptures is what we talk about with Job. There's the suffering for your faith. The only reason Job suffered anything is because God asked Satan, have you considered my servant Job? One who fears God, he eschews evil, he does all of these wonderful things. Have you considered him? And Satan's response was, he only serves you because of the great hedge that you've put around him. If you would let me affect him and afflict him, he won't serve you. And so God says, okay. Just don't touch him. Don't hurt him specifically. So Satan goes after Job and afflicts him with all of these problems, and then he comes back in chapter 2 after Job has not cursed God and died, and he says, well, you need to let me actually hurt him. If I can affect Job specifically now, he'll curse God and die. And the whole amount of suffering that we find with Job, where he writes, speaks as far as Job 14:1, man that is born of woman is few days and full of trouble, is all because Job served God. Then there's unexplainable suffering, things that happen that you can't necessarily put your finger on it, why it happens. There's no medical history that would cause it to happen. There's no sinful consequence of what you've done, but you go to the doctor and you're told you have cancer. And you can't explain why that happened. And the doctor tells you that it is an aggressive form of cancer, and you're going to suffer. Or you go to the doctor and he tells you that we can't really explain why this is happening, but you're dealing with this infirmity. What can you do to cause that? Sometimes, much like we find with the Apostle Paul, who says, I was given a thorn in the flesh to try to buffet me, and he says, Satan's the one who did this to me. I don't believe he means specifically that Satan smote him with a sickness. I think he's talking more along the lines of what we know, that sin and death were brought into this world, and when those things were brought in, sickness and all of the other horrible tragedies came with them. And we find Paul saying, I have a thorn in the flesh, and I would love to get rid of it, but God has told me no, so I'm going to have to take pleasure in my infirmities. But the devil tries to use suffering to say, don't talk to people. You're going through a lot. You're dealing with a lot. But he also tries to muddy the waters doctrinally. And here are some of the examples that I heard often in local work and still hear them from people. But the number one argument that I would hear when I would invite someone to church, invite someone to an activity that we were having was, well, I already go to church. I'm good in that department. I'm kind of churched up, if you know what I mean. I go down to Victory Life Faith Baptist Presbyterian First, United Church down the road, and they've got me covered. And they tell me that that's enough. But simply going to church is not what we're really asking people to do. We're not asking people to be good people. Cornelius was a good man. You look at Acts chapter 10 and verses 1 through 2, there was not another man that I have found as far as in that time that you could say was as good as it would ever get without the Lord than Cornelius, and yet he lacked something. He was religious. He believed in God, but he didn't have what he needed. And the devil has convinced so many people that simply going into a church building somewhere is enough, and therefore they tell people when they are asked to go to another church, they say, well, I've already gotten a church. I've already gotten that taken care of. I don't need to go anywhere else. But the second argument that you often hear is, well, I'm a good person. What would God really do for me? I'm already a good person. But again, you can go back to Cornelius and ask the question, was he not a good person? Was Cornelius considered to be an individual that was hated among his community? No, I think Cornelius was a pretty good guy, and yet he lacked something. And the argument has to be that what he lacked was God, truly having God, being in what we've said is a covenant relationship with Him through baptism, being a part of God's family, not just being religious. The churches of Galatia that are written to in the book of Galatians, they were religious. They'd gone back to the Old Testament. They were even, in many cases, you could argue, trying to serve God. And yet Paul says, you're not serving God when you follow after a law that has been done away and we've been given a better law. You should leave that law and go to the law that will actually help you. Being a good person is just not enough. But probably the other argument that is used a lot that makes evangelism hard and makes Bible studies hard is, that's just your interpretation of that. You and I just see it differently. I don't know if you've seen the picture, and I wish I'd thought about it to put into the PowerPoint tonight, but I just didn't until just now. But you ever seen the picture of the person that's looking at a 6, and the other person's looking at it from the other angle, and they're both yelling that it's a different number? One saying it's a 9, one saying it's a 6. And the caption often reads, they're both correct. You just have to see it from their perspective. Well, there's a problem with that. Who wrote the number down there? Did they write a 6 or did they write a 9? When they put that down there, they said, well, it's really both. No. Have you ever seen those cards, the flash cards that'll show a 6 and a 9, and they'll have a little line underneath to show you which number's which? You know why they do that? So you can tell the difference. So you can actually show this number is this number is that. I can look at a number like the number 6 and say, well, that's a 9 to me, but that doesn't change it on the math test if I write down the answer incorrectly. I can't then say to my teacher, well, I thought it was a 9. My teacher would say, you should have flipped the page back over and made it to where you could read it correctly. The same is true with the Bible. It's not enough to say, I guess we just don't see it the same way, but that's okay. That wasn't okay in Nehemiah chapter 8 when they had been told that they needed to keep a feast of booths, and they hadn't been doing that for generations since the days of Joshua. No one that day said, well, I guess they interpreted it that they needed to do that, but we've seen the light. We know better. We know what we need to do is different from that. That's not what they said. They went out and they built booths. They made sure that they had everything that they needed to keep God's command. The same is true today. But those are the three arguments that we often hear, is that, hey, it's just your interpretation. We just see it differently. I'm a good person. I go to church. But those aren't enough. And if we're not careful, we can kind of do what I caught myself doing too often with people. Well, I go to church. Okay, have a nice day. And you kind of move on. Why do I just move on? Why don't I stop for a moment and try to develop some type of friendship with that person? I was fortunate living in Oakland that they had a Parks and Rec in that area, and one of the things that I was blessed to be able to do was coach flag football. And no, it is not real football, I know that, but hey, in 2019, my Steelers won the championship in that flag football season, 5th through 8th grade, thank you very much, and we shut out our opponent in the championship match. Therefore, it's real to me, okay? That's what matters. But for 5 years, I coached, minus 2020, and at the end of every season, you know what I did? I would call the parents and say, will you bring your kids to the Somerville Church of Christ on this date, at this time? We're going to have an end of the season cookout. And the whole time that they're there, they're out playing, they're out having fun, and I'm having an opportunity to meet parents and to give the opportunity to come to church. And when I walked around in the community and got to go from place to place, ever so often I'd hear, Coach Clark, Coach Clark. Oh, hey man, how are you doing? Opportunity. Developing a friendship. Some of those parents told me right out to my face, don't invite me to church. I wasn't rude about it when I invited everybody, but I would just extend the opportunity. That's what it's about. And those same arguments have been uttered to all of us in this room at one time or another. Satan wants the door to stay closed. And if he gets his way, we'll do what I used to do. Okay, and we'll move on to the next person without even any type of effort or fight. But that's not what we need to be doing. You know, the devil wants hell to be populated. Let me give you a beautiful but haunting thought as well. When you and I read Matthew 7:13 and 14, and we're told that many will go down to the path of destruction, and few will be there that find the good path, the narrow and straight way. The most beautiful thing about heaven also becomes the most harrowing and haunting thought about hell. It is never at capacity. A couple of years ago, my wife and I were in Nashville, and we had wanted to go to a specific restaurant that is owned and operated by one of my favorite singers, and we put our name on the list. We got our reservations approved. We show up to the door saying we have a reservation, only to be told, I'm sorry, we're at capacity. And I said, how can that be? I have a reservation. And they said, well, last minute, a prominent person came in and rented out the whole restaurant for a party. You know what they're really saying? Mr. Clark, you don't have enough money to get into this place tonight because somebody's bought the place out for the night. And defeated, we walked away. We had already picked out what we wanted to eat. We were looking so much forward to getting the opportunity to go to that restaurant, only to be told, sorry, you can't make it in. Several events throughout history have been at capacity, and someone wanted to buy tickets or wanted to go and attend that event but couldn't get in. Is there any scripture that says that those who serve God and live for Him will get to the day of judgment and be told, man, if you'd been here 5 minutes earlier, we could let you in. But unfortunately, we just allowed the last person to go in. We're at capacity. That's not going to happen. But the same is true with hell. The devil's never going to say, proverbially calling up to God and saying, all right, that's enough. I can't take any more people. He always is looking for one more person. He wants hell to be populated, and in doing so, he wants people to be miserable like he is. You talk about being petty. The devil doesn't want you because he genuinely cares about you. He doesn't want me because he thinks I have something genuine to offer. He wants God to suffer and me to be miserable just like he is. Does that really sound like somebody who has Michael's best interest at heart or your best interest at heart? No. But he wants that door to stay closed, and he's done a very good job in many places of convincing people to keep that door closed. And so we think about being successful, and the question becomes necessary to ask, how do we measure success? You know, I think it is unfortunate in many cases that a quarterback can step back, he can throw a perfect pass, and it bounces off the wide receiver's chest and into the hands of a defender, and the quarterback is credited as having thrown that interception. Now, wait a minute. You mean to tell me that even though the wide receiver didn't catch it, it's the quarterback's fault? That's what the statisticians say. That's what I'm told every Sunday when that type of thing would occur. It doesn't matter what might have happened. The stats say this: And that's what it means. And so you might look at a day and see that a quarterback's thrown a couple of interceptions, had an otherwise pretty good game as well, but maybe both of them were bounced off of a defender or off of the receiver into a defender's hands, and he might have had a really great game except those two bad mistakes by other people. And yet, you know what most of the analysts will talk about for the rest of the week? Well, he threw 2 interceptions, and he really needs to clean that up. And the talk shows that are in existence, I gave it a year. I watched some of them, and then I finally realized they don't know what they're talking about mostly, and they're just trying to find drama and something that would be able to be talked about in some type of clickbait way. And they harp on the most insane things to harp on, and they say certain things doesn't measure up for success and other things do that don't really matter, and they just talk to talk. There's no substance. But when you and I look at evangelism, how do we measure success? How am I found to be successful in evangelistic effort? And when you and I look at the prophets, we find that success was defined differently. I find it incredible to read 2 Peter 2:5, where it talks about Noah was a preacher of righteousness. For 120 years, he preached. How many people told him no? Everyone that ever heard the message. Every single person that Noah preached to, save his family who made it onto the ark with him, those 8 souls, every other person that heard his words denied them and said, I'm not going to listen. And so if you look at what the world's population was at that time, and if you averaged out how many people Noah preached to on a daily basis, on a yearly basis, his average, if you will, would be among one of the worst averages that could possibly be in existence. And yet, he is one of the most successful preachers that we have record of. And Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 2, 1 through 10, was told, I'm sending you to a hard-headed people that do not want to listen, will not listen to you. And so, Ezekiel, to help you, I'm going to soften them up a little bit. No, Ezekiel, to help you, I'm going to make your head just as hard, if not harder. And I often wonder what Ezekiel's thought process must have been like when he first heard that. I'm sending you to a hard-headed people. Okay, God, how are you going to help me? I'm going to make you more stubborn. I'm going to make you a little bit harder-headed than they are so that you can handle them. Is there nothing else that you could do to maybe make them more receptive? Hard-headed's great and all, but I kind of would like them to be receptive more than hard-headed. You telling me there's nothing else? No, I'm going to make you hard-headed so that you can handle them. And yet, both Ezekiel, Noah, Daniel, countless other prophets that we have record of throughout the Old Testament were all successful if they simply gave the chance. Even the prophet that didn't want to prophesy, Jonah, when he finally listened to God and went to Nineveh and he preached that message, was successful. And was not just successful that a few people changed, the whole city changed. And Jonah hated that they changed. And yet, because he preached God's message, yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown, and he gave them what they needed to know, they were able to change their lives. No matter what happens, no matter how many people you and I talk to, no matter how many times we hear the words, no, I'm not interested, I'm a good person, I go to church, you just see the Bible differently than I do. No matter how many times that might happen, every time you give the opportunity, you have been successful. Because that's what we find about the prophets. If we start to measure success with how many people become Christians, we will become discouraged very quickly. And I've never heard of a single passage a single verse that would indicate that on the day of judgment for preachers, for elders, deacons, members, that God is going to say, and what's your tally? How many people did you baptize into Christ? You got 22? He got 23. We're going to let him in instead of you. It's not what it's about. It's about the opportunity. And that's further shown with Jesus himself, because Jesus was successful. And Jesus preached for 3 years, is widely considered by everyone in the religious world, if not completely considered, to be the greatest minister that has ever lived. And I believe he was. I think that's the only minister that we could ever find that was truly the greatest of all time. And everybody loved and followed him, right? Jesus couldn't get people to stay away from him, could he? Actually, people wanted Jesus to die. They wanted nothing to do with him. And on multiple occasions, though Jesus came to seek and save the lost, those lost individuals were telling him no. And he spoke hard but necessary truths and was sometimes rejected for those truths, like John 6:66, where he was told that after he had finished preaching all of these things, he watched as many of his disciples, not the people that were just there listening, many of his followers turned and walked with him no more. And you can almost hear maybe the discouragement when he asked the apostles, the disciples that remained, the 12, will you also go away? I don't know what it's like to be viral, have something that gets tons of clicks and likes and follows and all of the things that so many of our world has become obsessed with. But I've read the stories before of someone who makes a misstep. They do something that they probably shouldn't have done, and all of a sudden they just start losing followers. And their account is just plummeting. And they try to fix it to get their following back up because that's their livelihood in many cases. And so oftentimes, even if what they did wasn't wrong, but they're told it's wrong, they'll walk it back, trying to get people to come back and follow them. Did Jesus say as those people were walking away, hold on, did you hear this? I really meant this. Let me tell you something that you'd rather hear so that you'll stay and follow me. It's not what he did. Jesus wasn't mean about it. He wasn't rude and said, well, go on then. I don't want nothing to do with you anyway. But he understood that what he had said was the truth. And whether people like it or not, whether people agree with it or not, or even want to hear it, the truth is the truth. It's not up for debate. Once the truth has been proclaimed, there is no changing it. And so many people left him, despite the care that he showed for them. I referenced this recently in one of our classes here, but Matthew 14 through 16 talks about Jesus being told by the disciples, it's getting late, it's kind of getting dark outside, we probably need to send people home so they can go get their food. And Jesus looks at the disciples and says, you give them something to eat. And that's pretty puzzling because I don't remember reading that the disciples turned the food into a multitude of food for the people that were present. Jesus did that. And yet we pointed out that Jesus wasn't saying that it was their responsibility in that moment to give them food, but that it was their responsibility to realize we should be concerned about the people that are following after the Savior like we are, and if they're hungry and we can fill that need, we need to give them something to eat. That's what Jesus did. And it's no wonder in the book of Acts, beginning in chapter 2 and verses 42 through 47, where we find the greatest example of Christian living and church practice, that the church members sold what they had to take care of the needs of the membership. Where'd they learn that from? They learned it from Jesus when he said, you give them something to eat. You take care of their needs. And despite all of the good that Jesus did, he was rejected and killed for it. And I think that I'm going to be different. I think that somehow I might preach or evangelize more effectively. There is no other effective way than what Jesus did. And the thing that needs to be remembered about ministering like Jesus is that it's not going to make you popular. Do you know who cares if you die or I die and everyone in the brotherhood knows who we are? Honestly, what does that matter? It doesn't matter if there are 5 people in a building, if there are 5,000 people in a building. The gospel message needs to be preached and needs to be held in such a high regard and esteem by the people who proclaim it that it's not about becoming famous. It's not about becoming well known and on every lectureship or gospel meeting or all of the other things that are in existence. It's simply about giving the truth and an opportunity for people who don't have it to learn about it. No one on the day of judgment who has been a well-known preacher, elder, member, is going to be told by God, oh, get them to the front. We need to give them the special treatment. It's not what happens. If Jesus, the greatest minister that has ever walked this earth, can be despised, rejected, and killed, I should really expect no less for myself. And if I have a mindset about some type of famous lifestyle that becoming a preacher would give me, I need to get out of preaching. It's not what it's for. Jesus didn't want that for him or for his apostles that we're about to look at here, who were also successful. And the apostles, though they have more recorded success as far as so many of the New Testament, when we talk about conversions, is shown after the day of Pentecost, and therefore the apostles are involved in doing that, but they weren't successful because of their conversions either. You know, that they were allowed to go into every part of the world. They that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. Everywhere. There was not a place on the earth that had a soul that needed to be saved by the gospel that the gospel didn't have a chance to reach. And they didn't have Facebook and YouTube and all of the other apps and computers and planes and cars and all of the wonderful pieces of technology that we have. And I would venture to say, in large part, with many of the churches in our world, they were more successful than we are with all of that stuff. Because we don't use it like we should at times. We're not involved in asking, how can we reach the uttermost parts of the earth? Which is what the disciples were told in Acts 1:8 that they were going to accomplish. And they did that by Acts 8:4. Acts is 28 chapters long, and it took them 7 chapters to do what God had said that they were going to do. We need to get back to doing that. They were successful and at times had the opportunity to preach to prominent and powerful people. I was blessed the last year that I lived in Oakland to be on the Parks and Rec Advisory Board. It sounds more important than it really is. All I got to do was sit in a room with other people on the advisory board, and I would hear about a proposal, and I would say, well, I have these opinions, that opinion, and we would vote on it, and then the mayor and board of aldermen would decide whether or not it would actually happen. We had no power. But it gave me the opportunity to meet the mayor of my town and get to spend time with them and get to spend time with the aldermen and all of those other individuals and to be on a first-name basis with them. And that was a blessing, but also a responsibility to then look at those men and say, we have church just down the road every Sunday. We have Bible classes on Wednesday. We have activities that we like to do with our members and with the community. We would love for you to come and be a part of that. Only to be told on many occasions, even by the mayor, I do church in my own backyard. Okay. The more powerful people that you meet, the greater the responsibility becomes to share the gospel with them. And that's what the apostles were involved in doing. In fact, when we think about ourselves, how we can evangelize, obviously the book that the students have gotten for so many years here, Go Ye means go me. The mindset that what Jesus said to those disciples in Matthew 28:18 through 20 doesn't just apply to them. And someone may argue and they may want to quarrel over the fact, well, he just said it to the disciples. Okay, When I read then that Christian living in Acts 2:42 through 47 is following after the apostles' doctrine, does that mean that I'm exempt from telling other people? I'm not. And so I have to do the same thing. I've got to go in the first place because people need a preacher, because God's entrusted us with His wealth. The parable of the talents is not an issue because the individual didn't try to go out and do anything with it. It was that he buried it in the dirt and said there was nothing that he could do with it. He could have gone to every single place and failed and come back and been given a better report than what he had done by just burying that talent in the dirt. Because the master said, couldn't you have at least gotten me my interest in the bank? Those talents are not what you might be good at in doing singing or being involved in being a great painter or someone that's very skilled at something. Those talents are the opportunities and the responsibility that we have to go out and reach souls. And everyone has an opportunity to reach someone. Maybe some have a greater opportunity than others, but it doesn't mean that you or I, if we don't have that great of an opportunity, are any less responsible for seeking souls. What do we do before we go and evangelize? The Bible tells us that we need to pray constantly. James 5:16, the idea of the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much or accomplishes much. And so if I start to pray more on a regular basis about reaching souls, what's the chances that my opportunity to reach souls will increase? If I start to pray more for the congregation here to reach more souls, and for the ministers here and the elders and the deacons and all of the people that are involved in the work here to have an opportunity to reach that person that they've always wanted to talk to or that they've been working on, what is the likelihood that all of a sudden we'll see people coming into through these doors that we've never met before, but you know who they are, or someone here knows who they are, and they become a Christian? And finally, we go to the people, and I want you to think about this. We share the gospel all over, everywhere that we can, and I just want to leave you with this last point. Every soil is different. You will have people tell you no. You'll have people who become a Christian and will fall away. You'll have people who, they just don't want to hear it at all. But what we need to remember more than anything is that we have a responsibility to reach out. If we do that and just give the opportunity, that's enough. And God will be pleased with me and with you. Lord willing, next week, Brother Josh Walker will be in here teaching. And again, I look forward to that. But